Racing Revolution, with host J.J. O'Malley, explores the ever-changing landscape of American sports car racing and the groundbreaking impact of the Daytona prototype. From a back-of-the-napkin concept to an international icon, this race car has produced countless on-track highlights and just as many behind-the-scenes stories. Pulled from the pages from the book The Daytona Prototype, the concept that revolutionized American sports car racing, these stories are brought to life here on A Racing Revolution. Now, here's your host, J.J. O'Malley.
Welcome to the first episode of our podcast series, A Racing Revolution. We explore the enduring legacy of the Daytona prototype race car. Today we are joined by Mark Raffauf, who currently serves as Senior Director of Race Operations for IMSA. He was very instrumental in the development of the Daytona prototype and continues to play a key role in American sports car racing. Well, Mark, welcome to A Racing Revolution.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, your background in the sport goes back to the early days of IMSA. In fact, you wrote a book, your own book about that with Mitch Bishop. But so
Correct.
You got to see the development, the beginnings, development of both the Camel GTP prototype and the World Sports Car. So what's your thoughts as you, from your early experiences in the sport working with greats like John Bishop?
Well, it's an interesting perspective. I started in '74 when IMSA basically ran just GT cars, which then morphed into the 935 big turbo car eras, the BMW turbos, the Ford turbos, and that in turn morphed into, in the early '80s, GTP as the first prototype category, which carried on for well over a decade with a simple set of rules that were about 4 pages long in the IMSA rulebook. And then that was replaced in '93 because it had kind of run its course economically, and the World Sports Car was introduced, and that ran its course well into the beginning of Grand Am a decade later, into 2003, before Grand Am developed the Daytona prototype. So the perspective I have is every form of prototype car I've been involved with, we've taken some of the best characteristics from the previous type car and included them in the next one, and in some cases took some things away. So particularly between GTP and DP, your big differences were a lot less tire, a lot less downforce, and a lot less power. And in spite of all that, they ended up DP cars went going just as fast as a 962 almost could from earlier, because development of tires, they were smaller, but they worked better. Flat bottom instead of tunnels. So what we've always tried to do, and then we did again in this time frame with DPI, and we'll do the same with LMDH in the future, is to try and learn from each categories. What were the good things? What were the bad things? And the goal, we had a goal in DP when that car was developed by a team of people to produce a car, and we worked backwards from what the end result was that we wanted. And that's been a common IMSA policy in the past, was what do we want the end product to be like and how do we want it to perform, and then put the rules together so that that product would do exactly that.
Yeah. Well, it was pretty turbulent times back in beginning, say, 96 or so after John Bishop retired. We had professional sports car racing, the USRRC. Don Panos came and started the American Le Mans Series. Grand Am was formed in 2000, but I think they were looking for a signature race car. And what was it like in the meetings that you had in and out of office with people like Jim France, Roger Edmondson, Hurley Haywood, Bob Snodgrass, to talk about the future vehicle, which eventually became the DP?
DP car was conceived to be a car that anybody could drive, privateers, professionals, anybody. Simple, straightforward, and it did create probably the most diverse group of participants from various forms of motorsports ever in any top-ranked class. There were sports car, IndyCar, Formula One, obviously NASCAR. There's even motorcycle racers who succeeded and in these cars. So the cars were relatively easy to drive fast, obviously the very best guys learned how to drive them very fast. And so the product was conceived, and we worked backwards technically to make the car perform at the level we wanted it to perform. So it was kind of an interesting way to do it, but it's the way that IMSA kind of worked prior to that with World Sports Car and GTP, was to establish a target of performance and then build a car around it. And in the case of the DP car, make it cost effective and simple. And it was both of those.
And I know you like to have a little notebook at your side in our staff meetings, and I could picture you jotting notes on a cocktail napkin. How did that work out?
Well, a lot of people, excuse me, know that I'm a doodler in meetings, and it helps me kind of listen better. I don't know why, but John Bishop was as well, so maybe I picked up that bad habit from him. But a lot of times you draw airplanes, and a lot of times you draw cars, but and John did as well. But I started doodling cars conceptually when we began talking about creating our own car that were kind of based on not anything in particular, but dimensionally kind of like a Ford GT40, okay, which was both a potent race car and a very potent road car. So it's not a GT car, it was a prototype car. So conceptually, size-wise, using that as a starting point, I would doodle in these meetings various shapes and dimensions and sizes and what the cars could look like. And so from that, obviously, some of those napkins ended up at some of the constructors' tables, and they converted that into a car. And so I don't want to say I had a lot to do with it, but I just sit and listen and be part of those discussions and kind of draw a little bit on napkins and notepads and stuff, what that could look like, how tall, how wide, what it needed to do performance-wise. A lot of people look at them and say, well, they weren't the most attractive. No, but there's reasons behind that. We had a distinctive desire not to make the cars too fast in a straight line, which they could be with minimal downforce, with not a whole lot of power. So frontal area and the size of the car was an important factor in that performance envelope that we wanted to hit.
You're listening to A Racing Revolution from Edge Set Studios. The Daytona Prototype, the concept that revolutionized American sports car racing, is a complete history of the iconic race car. The 276-page coffee table book traces the history of every car that raced on North America's most prestigious racetracks between 2003 and 2016. The encyclopedic detail in this book is paired with amazing photography and the stories behind the story of the Daytona Prototype. Available now from Amazon. Now, back to our conversation and your host, J.J. O'Malley.
I think it might have been Dave Watson sent the cocktail, one of the napkins, to Dave Clem at Fabcar, and he came up with the rendering, which he sent to Grand Am, and Jim France ordered 2 cars for
pretty much,
Ops
yeah. That's almost exactly what happened. Dave was one of the first ones to commit to, I can do this. A lot of the initial constructors were essentially fabricators, so giving them a very tight box and within which to build the car and what it would look like and how big it was, and standardizing a lot of components and a lot of characteristics amongst all of them gave a lot more people the opportunity to make a pretty good business out of building and running and supporting those cars, as well as the teams, which it showed out in time how many of them participated with DP cars, and the quality of the racing, which is unsurpassed, in my opinion, in history. It is the closest closed wheel road racing ever.
Well, I remember at the Daytona USA, the little cocktail room up there, we had a dinner and they unveiled, this would have been just before the 2002 Rolex 24. They unveiled the Brumos cars. And I think the fact that it had the iconic Brumos livery, coupled with the name Hurley Haywood, who was one of the most successful endurance drivers in history, really add credence to the new project.
Yeah, I think getting anything new started, and at the time Grand Am was pretty much running the old world sports cars in various configurations, a wide variety of GT cars, and it was all a step-by-step process for Grand Am to establish its own identity with its own product, both in a prototype class and in a single GT class. So once the prototype program got underway, we turned off to GT, but like I said, the car was designed to be able to be driven by anybody, privateers, professionals, whatever. And obviously, again, the best guys got it going the fastest. But a lot of people should have recognized early on that you could be successful in this car, even as an amateur with a pro co-driver. And in many cases, those guys won races against the pros on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think there were only 6 DPs at the 2003 Rolex 24. 4 of them barely made it off the grid. And yet at the end of the season, there were 10 cars. In the next year's Rolex 24, we had Tony Stewart and Jimmy Johnson and all kind of drivers there.
And I think there was like 20 cars. It went from 10 to 17 at the test in the fall to 20 at the Roar, and then the race was even more, I think. But yeah, they were easy to build. They're inexpensive to operate. They were easy to fix at the racetrack. Everything about them was user-friendly to the racer, technically.
Yeah, and it attracted the high-level competitor that you were aiming for, and they seemed to be able to step in and be very competitive right off the bat.
No question. Anybody that could drive a race car, any kind of race car, and in many cases, or a few cases, as you know, JJ, motorcycle guys, could make that transition rather easily.
Yeah, well, I remember Emerson Fittipaldi tested one, and there was talk of getting him with his nephew and his son-in-law, Max Pappas and Christian Fittipaldi. That would have been quite a lineup, but it never really happened.
Yeah, but if you look at the decade they ran and you look at all the different people who drove it, it's the who's who of motorsports for 15 years worldwide are in there. And that's a strong statement because they raced them and they raced them hard, and the quality of the competition was superb.
Yeah, I think Bill Riley said one of his personal highlights of watching the races was at a Daytona race where Sylvain Tremblay, in his new one of his first races in a Riley, was able to pass his car with the Wayne Taylor car and also the Ganassi car to take the lead at Daytona. And it showed that with the right preparation, anybody could be competitive in a DP.
Yeah. Sylvain is a very accomplished driver, but he came out of production cars predominantly, but he made that step into those cars easily and obviously demonstrated he could race against the best in them.
Yeah, and talk a little bit about the transition from the original DP to the second generation after 5 years.
Well, after 5 years, we had, in the beginning, had planned to have some sort of progression of the car. The important part of the car, and one of the things that was unique about it, was you could take all the bodywork off and it was still a functional car. Okay, so it was a car with bodywork on it. You could take the engine out of it and roll it around the garage intact. It didn't fall apart and crash to the ground. So it was like a real car. So from year to year, after 5 years, one of the things was easiest thing to change is the appearance. So we left the 5 constructors at that time still in the game the opportunity to redo bodywork and change the look of the car. And then we did that a second time with Gen 3, I think 3 or 4 years after that. But everything underneath is pretty much, when you look at a Corvette DP car from the last generation and you look at a Riley or a Crawford or a whatever, the basic car underneath it is the same. And that's what's kind of unique about it is the Riley was always a Riley. They had a minimum structure they had to maintain. They had to use certain componentry, all that sort of stuff. And they were using the same stuff 10 years later, which made it really cost effective for the teams and good business for everybody involved because they could design one and only one thing and pretty much everybody was using that one thing. So, yeah. But yeah, the transition was one for appearance, make them look different. And some changed a lot, the ones that needed some aero work, and some changed less. They also brought Dallara and Lola in place of previous constructors, and they didn't build new cars. They simply took the existing cars and did what was allowed in that upgrade after 5 years. They became winning cars and did it again when Gen 3 came along.
Yes, and I think aesthetically, the Corvette DP was one of the best looking race cars we've had in this.
Yeah, the Gen 3 car, both of them, the Riley was the other one that made it that far, are both very attractive cars. The previous ones, depending on the angle, even the Fab car, I've got some great photos of it. It's a good looking car. It's just a different kind of car. And as time evolved, Grand Am evolved what could be allowed, and the biggest significant change was a reduction in the greenhouse, which came about by more or less going to a restrictor system on the engines to control the power. While in the initial beginnings, the engines were kind of wide open and restricted by what they could be, but they quickly showed that there was more there than, as always with engines, there's always more there. So the going to restrictors allowed the engines to be capped at a certain point, which allowed some of the bodywork constraints to be opened up to make them end up the way they did. And you're right, the Corvette's a pretty spectacular car.
Yeah. Well, during the week, you would be in the Grand Am offices talking with the manufacturers, the suppliers, the teams, getting tweaking the rules. And then on weekends, you got to oversee the actual running of the races, which was unbelievable.
Yeah, to have that opportunity, I mean, it doesn't come but once in your lifetime, but I pretty much got to see, as the race director, every race that was ever run, and got to see it in a way that very few people get to see it live with TV replay and stuff like that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the quality of the racing and the ability of the people driving the cars put on one of the most competitive, entertaining, unpredictable racing programs ever for a long time. But every race, there was 9 or 10 cars minimum that could win the race. And so it was a fight throughout. And it was just a lot of fun to watch really good people do a good job. And when I say really good people, it included privateers, it included professionals, it included the Ganassis, it included Penske, it included Wayne Taylor, it included Bob Stallings, it included Peter Barron, included a lot of people, Max Crawford, a lot of different drivers. But it was really, really amazing competition. And it's if you ever go through a season, any good season, you could just go, oh, that was a great race. And your task to me of trying to pick the 10 most exciting races for the book was pretty daunting, because there's 50 or 100. I did 120 something races in 10 years, and anything more than a 2 or 3 second margin of victory was extremely rare. Everything was tenths of a second or a second, and not just 1 or 2, but sometimes a freight train or 6 or 7 cars in a row crossing the line right after each other, which in road racing was unheard of.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty unbelievable to see the DPs on the race course at Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and they put on a heck of a show there too.
Absolutely, yeah.
I remember Rubens Barrichello.
Yeah, Barrichello in the Dallara, and Kevin Dorn's Dallara, and the other guy who stands out from those was Sebastian Bourdais, who got into Peter Barron's car, having, I don't think, driven one but once, and taken it to the front. Just those guys could race those cars.
Yeah, Peter Barron was a very competitive car owner.
Yep.
Almost won the Rolex 24 a few times.
Yeah.
Won Indianapolis a few times.
Yeah, twice, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. You got a guy like Bob Stallings, who was, I guess, a club racer, and he came with his coach, Alex Gurney, and became a winning competitor in Grand Am, and built into a super team that was challenging Ganassi and Taylor and them every week.
As did Taylor, from the beginning. But yeah, Bob brought Gurney, and basically they went from sort of sorting it out to being the champions a couple years later against very stiff competition. Not only required speed and longevity and durability, but it required reliability, and he put together a really good operation, as did the other guys. They were top-notch teams.
Yeah. What about the world speed record attempt?
That was a lot of fun. I oversaw that with Mr. Shank with a twin turbo EcoBoost Ford Riley Gen 3 car here at Daytona International Speedway. And it just went to show how fast one of those cars can go with limited power, because of the relatively low downforce they produced, much more like a GT or a road car, as opposed to the previous generations of prototypes that had gigantic wings and diffusers, and before that, tunnels. So the car, I think, did 221 or something.
Yeah.
I don't remember the numbers, but it was amazing to watch Colin Braun drive it around the banking at Daytona, because to do the speed run, you just didn't run the track on the oval like you would for road racing, nor did you run the car that way. They trimmed it out, But once they got it right, I mean, he said that, you know, you kind of just put your fingers on the steering wheel and it went around that high groove really fast. And so those records were unique, not unique, but all those kind of closed course records are done from a standing start. So you need big gears to get to top speed once you're up to speed, but just like some of the old restrictor plate racing with NASCAR, it took a while. So the first lap was kind of slow, but the second lap got pretty fast. The third one got faster, and the fourth one, the car was flying, you know, 230 miles an hour, 229 or something. So 221, I don't remember what it was, but it's broke the world closed course speed record for a car of that displacement, which was held by Mercedes, the famous C111 test car at Nardo, which is a 7-mile oval in Italy. And to do that here at Daytona was special, because I think it would even go faster at Talladega, but we wanted to do it here at Daytona.
Yeah,
So
I know.
Broke the track record for Daytona and then broke the FIA world record for 10 kilometers and 10 miles from a standing start.
I was researching for Jim France on the Daytona speed records, and Mark Donohue, when he had the Porsche 917-30, kind of struggled at Daytona getting it up to speed, but obviously went super fast at Talladega, 217 miles an hour?
Yeah. And then if you might have been there, but if you remember in 79, Peter Gregg tried to break it in a 935, and he broke it, but you have to break the previous record by a certain percentage. And he didn't make it by the percentage, but it was right under 200 at that time. It was like 199.8 or something like that. But other people have tried, but Daytona is really fast. Talladega for that sort of stuff is faster.
Now, Mark Raffauf, looking back, without the 14 years of experience with the DP, do you think we could have seen this evolution into the current breed of race car?
Conceptually, the DP car is what starts where we are today, no question. Before that, prototypes were purely prototypes, no relationship to a manufacturer's brand or identity. So that concept certainly carries through. Technically, the type of cars we deal with today are 10, 20 times more advanced, technically, both in structure, aerodynamics, engine management, all primarily through electronics, which, you know, back in 2000, whatever, 4 or 5, we sprung on DP the fact you're all going to have to use the same management unit, ECU. You could put this much in it, and you would have thought we were murdering everybody. But after about 6 months, everybody went, you know what, this isn't that bad. It's easy, it's simple, it's cost effective. Some of those ECUs are still in those cars today, 15 years later, functioning like they originally were intended to. And that partnership with Bosch, who made those, exists again today in helping us manage the much bigger technological task at hand with the diversity of engines and the diversity of power plants and turbo and non-turbo and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Mark Raffauf. We appreciate you joining us on A Racing Revolution, talking about the book, The Daytona Prototype, the concept that revolutionized American sports car racing. Currently available on Amazon, and you're a contributing writer with the Welcome and the 10 Greatest Races, as well as probably reading the book 4 or 5 times for help with the editing, which is always one of the biggest chores. So
I thank you, JJ, for undertaking the project and asking me to be part of it. It's an honor, and it's a great part of my career, and I think a lot of people's businesses, careers, drivers, team owners, all came from that era, and their successes today because of that. And we probably all need to kind of look at Mr. France, Jim, and you know, give him the credit for the vision of we need to create this kind of product. And I was just happy to be part of the process to create it. Thank you. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you, Mark. This is JJ O'Malley. Thank you for joining us. Be sure to pick up your copy of the Daytona Prototype from Amazon.com. Stay tuned for more podcasts tracing the DP history in A Racing Revolution.